Hello and a very warm welcome to this Lockdown LitFest event where I am delighted to introduce you to our guest today, Charles Spencer. Before I do though, I'm going to say what I normally say, which is we hope you're well, we hope you're taking care, and we hope that you're being safe. Charles, having read modern history at Oxford, became a presenter and a reporter variously for NBC News and Granada. And he's done reviews, written reviews, in fact, for The Guardian, for The Independent on Sunday. He's written features for The Daily Telegraph, The Sunday Telegraph, and for Vanity Fair, to name but a few. He's also been a presenter on the History Channel, speaking largely about Blenheim. Charles, a very warm welcome to the Lockdown LitFest.
Well, thank you, Paul. How lovely to be here. What a great idea to have this. I'm delighted to be part of it.
Well, you're very kind, and thank you for very nobly accepting my call to arms. Before we start, can we talk about whereabouts are you in the world? I'm in the middle of Oxford. No, not in Oxfordshire at all. I'm in Warwickshire with my 8-year-old dad. Where are you surviving lockdown?
I'm at Althorpe, my family home in Northamptonshire. So quite close, about 30 miles from you. Yes, I'm not going to complain. It's really a very lovely place to be locked down, and I'm incredibly fortunate.
And your family are all safe and well?
Yes, thank you, yes.
I'm delighted. Tell me a little bit about the History Channel, because I was intrigued to find out that you presented on Blenheim, of course, another great house of England. How did that come about?
I wrote a book on the Battle of Blenheim about 16 years ago, and I then ended up doing a 2-part documentary for the History Channel, which was great, actually. I'm a fan of history in all its forms, of course. And we traveled around Europe and put together the story of this great battle from just over 300 years ago. And obviously the reason that the palace was built in the first place was a celebration of the victory of the British against Louis XIV of France. So that was it, really. And it was tremendous fun. I did enjoy it. It combined two great loves of mine, TV and history. So it was a good thing.
Fantastic. And just memory serve that the book itself was a Sunday Times bestseller, if I remember.
Quite a surprise one. I remember, it's so funny, any authors are watching. I went to pitch the book to a publisher, and they thought it was so obscure, the Battle of Blenheim, people had forgotten about it unless they were at least 80 years old and had studied it in history at school. And they said, well, we're allowed to do that, but could you do something interesting afterwards? So I don't think they had huge hopes for the book. So
You've had another Sunday Times bestseller, which was Killers of the King, which is one of the 3 books that you've written so far, focusing on the Civil War. And I have to say, I love reading them. You have a fantastic prose style, but what I really love is your diligence in research. So can we sort of start at the top? Why focus on the Civil War? And just what joy does the research give you? Because I know that you love getting sort of down and dirty in the archives of libraries with it.
Well, I got involved in the Civil War actually as a follow-up to what I just said. I mean, the publishers, I was so naive about publishing. I said, well, what would constitute an interesting second book if you're prepared to tolerate the Battle of Blenheim? And they gave me, the publisher said, well, we'd like something on Elizabeth I or the English Civil War. And I thought, well, even then, by the way, even 16 years ago, everyone and everything to do with the Tudors had been quite well explored. So I thought I'd go Stuart, and I did a biography of this fantastic figure from 400 years ago, really. He was born 400 years ago last November. And he was Prince Rupert of the Rhine, this incredibly colourful figure from the Civil War, great royalist commander. And then, I don't know, I just got intrigued. There were so many fascinating characters, and I'm sure there are an equal number of wonderful characters from any point of history. But you touched upon the research for such a book. And really what was so intriguing to me was how much material there was. You know, this English Civil War, they were, in the 1640s, there were 3 English Civil Wars. And it was really at the same time as an explosion in printing in England. So you had these wonderfully one-sided pamphlets springing up on both sides. And I've always actually been very even-handed, I hope, in the Civil War. I certainly can see the point of both sides. But as a historian, as a narrative historian, I'm not an academic, but as a narrative historian, my task has always been with the Civil War to try and work out what the truth is, because it's rather like a divorce, really. You're getting such extreme sides, the husbands in the royalist reports and the wives in the parliamentary reports. And you feel like a judge who's got to work out what actually happened in this terrible breakdown.
I'm fascinated by that dynamic, Charles, because of course a lot of people will be aware of the phrase "victor's history." That those that win the battle, those that win the conflict, tend to get to write the history in their own likeness, if you want. How do you push through that? How do you get to the truth of both sides and show, as so often is the case, that actually the win was never predetermined. It can hinge on a knife edge.
I think what I found most convincing were not the broadcast pamphlets or whatever, which were clearly there to keep people happy and get morale going on your chosen side, but more the letters and the exchanges maybe in a courtroom, actually. I found that fascinating. You mentioned this book I did on the men who were brave enough to put together the case which ended in King Charles I being executed.
Mm.
And then my story is really what happened to them afterwards. And they were pursued around the world for their lives. And, but they wrote letters home and they wrote to each other and their families, and you get a feeling for the people. So for me, it's not a very original thing. For me, history is about people watching. And so the periods I study, you mentioned 3 of my books on the Civil War, so it's only 375 years ago. I don't think that the human species has changed really one jot in that time. And so I like to identify with the triumphs and the disasters and the hopes and disappointments and the achievements and successes of individual humans, but in a gripping setting. So each time I choose a book to write, I choose a flashpoint to tell the story around. So I wrote one on the Battle of Blenheim, which I mentioned. That really is a look at the story of John Churchill, Winston Churchill's ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, and his sidekick in the battle, and their romantic lives, etc. I'm not a military historian. I deal with people, as I say. And then Prince Rupert was just so dramatic. And if anyone knows anything about Prince Rupert, he's not famous at all now. He was a very glamorous royalist general. But, he also helped open up Canada by funding exploration there, and he invented various scientific achievements, and he also put together he was the first man to invent lithograph forming of engraving, and all sorts of things. And I like to bring back to life people and events which I don't think deserve to be forgotten.
Quite right too. Can we talk, before we come to the latest book, which is called To Catch a King, can we tease apart Killers of the King a little? Because one of the things that I really enjoyed about this is that you have a responsibility to the history, but you seem to have exercised the responsibility to have the clear voice of each of the participants speaking for themselves. So my question, I suppose, is, sort of slightly obliquely, when you're there and you've got their letters in front of you, do you feel that sort of direct physical connection with them and with history, and feel responsible for their memories, I suppose, in a way, and for their actions?
Yes, it's a very emotional moment when you're holding an important letter from somebody dealing with something that was of almost sacred importance to themselves. So I remember the first time I was in Oxford, actually, at the Bodleian, and I found these letters written by Henrietta Maria, the widow of King Charles I. And of course, they were the letters the letter she wrote on, the paper was tinged with black because she was in mourning. And it brought it home that, this is a great moment in history, and this king was killed, but also he was a husband and he left behind a widow. So those are the moments where you're humbled into, remembering the human element of the story. And I think it's important never to stray from that. And I try and bring alive the very basic ways in which people deal with terrible problems and things that are looming in their life that they can't possibly compute. And I remember one of the people who was behind the killing of Charles I. When he's about to be put to death, and he's learnt the terrible way he's going to go, which is hanging, drawing, and quartering, which is a very protracted, messy, and brutally painful way to be executed. He tries to put it into a logical sequence, and he manages to think, I could have died 25 years ago. I was in a terrible storm on the Irish Sea, and that ship could have sunk, and I wouldn't have even had the last 25 years. And then in terms of pain, he'd been near his wife when she'd given birth, and he had seen excruciating agony up close, and he was saying, well, at least he wouldn't have to suffer that repeatedly. And it's this sort of human necessity of trying to make sense of the things that are impossible to really understand.
Very timely for our, very timely counsel for our times as well, as we're all trying to make sense of this new paradigm in which we're living, which of course is taking so many lives.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Forgive me, I'm no historian. My background is in science, but maybe you can illustrate or illuminate something for me. You mentioned hanging, drawing, and quartering, and I've long suspected that that was the method of execution for those that the state really wanted to punish. And if they were going to pay them any deference at all, they would rather than hanging, drawing, and quartering, they go for straightforward execution, either with hanging or having their heads chopped off. Is that right, or am I misconstruing?
No, you're quite right. I mean, to be from my research, this is a punishment that came about by mistake.
Oh, really?
And it went back to medieval times, where if you were going to really mess up somebody's chances of being forgiven and having an eternal life, you would chop up their body and desecrate it, so that it would make it a very difficult human resurrection, I suppose. And from that, it became the ultimate punishment for high treason, for doing something against the monarch, which was such as assassination or attempted assassination. And yes, it was really awful. So by the time, really awful doesn't really do it justice. By the time of the 17th century, the hanging, drawing, and quartering was the ultimate in deterrence, I think. So the condemned prisoner was taken on a sled, really, and dragged through the streets to the place of execution, wearing a nightshirt, nothing more. Mm. And then they were allowed to say their confessions or address the crowd or whatever. And then they were hanged, but only to the point of unconsciousness. Yeah. And then they were cut down and woken up, and then they were disemboweled to the point where they were still alive. And then they were castrated while they were still alive. And then at some point they would die of blood loss and shock. And then their head and their quarters were chopped up. So it could take a very, very long time, and it was excruciatingly agonizing. There was one magnificent figure in this true story of what happened to the killers of the king, who was this religious lunatic, actually, called Thomas Harrison. And he was so convinced that it was an honor to suffer in this way, because he was going to suffer as he believed Christ had done, that he died incredibly bravely. And he was shaking when he was about to be hanged, and people were mocking him. He was a sort of great hate figure for the royalists. And he said, no, I'm not scared. I've just been in too many fights and battles, and I've taken too many blows, and it makes me wobble a bit. And then after they hanged him and had disemboweled him, he managed to get an arm free, and he knocked the executioner to the floor. And the crowd were just amazed by this, the bravado of it. And then actually it served him well, because the executioner finished him off very quickly. So he didn't have to go through endless agony. It was over. But it's interesting, actually, Paul, because you get to learn, when people were executed, there were two things on show here. It was a free public spectacle, I'm afraid to say, and they used to sell the seats around Tyburn, which is Marble Arch now in London. You could get the best seats for a price and watch these people at their end. But there was a sort of superstition, really, that the person would die according to their moral strength. So if they were very brave, it was a good end, as it were. But also it reflected on their cause. So if they could die bravely, it meant that God probably did have some feeling for their side, some positive feeling towards them. So it was a very important part of the day was how you behaved.
Good heavens. For those of you that may know London a little bit, if you go to Marble Arch, which is now a very large roundabout, usually with some stationary buses and a fantastic sculpture of a huge horse's head, there is a cross which marks the very site of the scaffold at Tyburn. And I find it somehow a connection with history. If you stand on that spot and you just think of what has come before, it's quite extraordinary. Charles, let's come to Catch a King. which is an extraordinary book. Its subtitle is Charles II's Great Escape. It's the most rip-roaring adventure that brings all your strengths in as a storyteller, as a did you call it a narrative historian? Yes.
Yes.
And your ability to write, your ability to research. When you figured out that you were going to write about this, it must have been with joy in your heart that you embarked on the research.
Yes, so I got a letter from somebody who had read previous books, and he said, oh, you really ought to write a book on the successful escape of Charles II when he was a young man. And I thought, well, everyone's done that. It must have been done to death. And then I looked it up, actually, and it hadn't been done for 50 years as a standalone volume. Of course, it had been included in the biographies of Charles II. And I thought, well, hang on, this is quite interesting. And then for British people watching this, they will very much know the name of Samuel Pepys. He was the most famous diarist of the 17th century. And he was quite an influential figure in the Navy and a member of Parliament, and had a very adventurous private life. So it was quite a sort of rip-roaring diary. And he happened to be on the ship that Charles II was on. Charles II escaped from England before his father was executed, and then waited most of the time in despair for a time where he might be able to come back. And in 1660, suddenly, England had sort of fallen into disarray, really. Oliver Cromwell had been effectively the dictator of England for nearly a decade, and he died, and there was nobody of the same standing in the army and Parliament to take over. And after some humming and hawing, Parliament asked the king to come back and take his throne. And Charles came back on a ship from his very long exile, and he ended up on the same ship as Peeps. And he said, well, you won't believe what happened the last time I was in England. And then he told this group of people on the ship the astonishing tale of his adventures on the run around 10 counties of England, with the whole of the parliamentary army looking for him to kill him. And Pepys was so stunned, he knew a good story when he heard it, that he spent the next 25 years going around trying to track down the eyewitnesses who Charles had mentioned and seeing if they could verify what he had said. So I must be incredibly fortunate, because so my prime researcher was actually Samuel Pepys. So I put together the stories that he had, the eyewitness accounts that he had collated. But the thing is, Pepys never got round to writing the story himself. And I think it's because by that stage he had lost his sight and he had been very busy with various other things. And also the king died, so it probably didn't seem so relevant. But it was a really extraordinary story. And there are so many times, even though I know the end, I mean, we know there was a Charles II, so, it's hardly, I'm not giving much away if I say he gets away. There are so many times where you think, well, he's really had it now. And equally, there are other times where you think, well, he's got away. But it was an adventure story that really comes alive, because I worked out what it was. What made it possible was that the communications were so appalling at the time. And people could never quite catch up with Charles while he was on the run.
How fascinating. Sorry, did you say Pepys never actually published these? So were you reading Pepys's handwritten notes, his diary entries and so on? How did that work?
To be honest, Paul, I couldn't make it out. So I was reading, there had been transcriptions taken of it. They do exist in Cambridge, but I was dealing with the actual, I wanted to get it absolutely spot on correct. So I was dealing with typed versions of it. But it was extraordinary to think that these, I mean, really such dramatic stories from people who helped Charles for a day, others who hid him for a week, and their motives. It took me back into a time where religion was so crucial to life. Yes. And the first few people who helped him on his way happened to be Roman Catholics in what was a fundamentally Protestant regime under Parliament. And they were used to hiding their own. They had priests or monks who came to England, Jesuits, who they would have to hide, otherwise they might be put to death. And so they used their hiding places in their houses, they used their network of support to get the king safely away.
Extraordinary. Do you have a priest hole at Althorpe?
No, we don't have a pre-salt. We have got one very strange room, which I don't know what it is, in one of the major, well, in fact, the largest bedroom in the house. Underneath is this large area, a sort of just, it's the size of a normal room, but there's nothing in it. And I think that's because we haven't been Catholic for a long time. I think it's just a quirk of the architecture of the house, because the house has changed form so many times. But no, but pre-salt, I was fascinated to learn about these. So these were the particular place which you would, only the master of the house would know where it was. And so if he was a Catholic, he could hide a priest or a Jesuit in there. And the people who built these, there was various sort of Catholic zealots who devoted their lives to designing incredibly intelligent pieces of, tunneling really in walls. And things became obvious, which I hadn't realized before, such as they never did the same design twice, because if one was found, the Protestants would look for the same in the next house. And I felt so sorry for one man who hid. He actually ended up becoming a saint. But he was a Catholic, and he hid for 10 days in this place. But the Protestants looking for him wouldn't go away. And the poor man didn't realize he was going to have to hide so long. So he'd only taken an apple into his hiding hole. And so in the end, he came out, and I'm afraid, had the terrible end, which I mentioned earlier. But you just think of the despair, on day 9 or whatever, thinking, I wish I brought more apples than that. You either had to starve to death or take your chances.
Oh, good Lord. Yes, that's a crash diet. I seem to remember, I have to confess, it's a few months since I last read To Catch a King.
Sure.
I seem to remember something rather sweet about Charles II. Did he repay the favours that had been paid to him for those that had helped him during his escape?
Yes, I think everyone who helped him on his way assumed he wouldn't make it.
Yeah.
But as he departed, each person, he just said, look, I promise I'll make it good one day. And it was incredible, really, because he came back to England in May, and within a month he started to do this. And there was one family of, really, I have to say, they were sort of living at a peasant level, a subsistent level in a wood, who had a variety of men in the family who risked their life for him. And he brought them all to the palace and rewarded them with pensions for eternity. And I've met some of their descendants who still get a share of £150 a year, which the only regret they have is that it wasn't index linked. But they still proudly share the reward that their ancestor earned in the 1650s.
Good, how extraordinary. I have to ask you, having done such a fantastic trilogy, what are you working on now? What can we expect from you? And what does the date, is it 1120? Well, is that seems to spring to my mind a minute. You're working even further back in history, am I right?
Yes. So I said earlier, I try and do stories that show an age, really. And yes, I am doing a book that's, I can't go into huge detail about it, but it happened exactly 900 years ago. And I came across it. It was because I was doing a talk for a fellow historian, Alison Weir. She has a company that takes Americans and others around the country with a theme. And one day, Alison, who's a friend of mine, rang and she said, look, what are you doing this evening? Because I need you to give a speech at Leeds Castle. And I went, oh, okay, I'll give it a go. What's the theme? And she said, could you do it on the Queens of England? And I said, well, I probably can. So I arrived at Maidstone in Kent and sat in a Starbucks and put together a speech. And then in that speech, it turned out I was giving a speech to incredibly well-read historian fans. And the only thing they jerked to life with any interest really in what I had to say was about an event from 900 years ago. And I didn't know it was the anniversary was coming up. And so I thought, well, I'll, let me see if there's something in this. And I was talking to my wife. I said, God, it was so interesting, because I then ended up giving that speech again. I had a literary festival here and somebody dropped out. So I gave the same speech. And again, this story grabbed everyone's attention. And I thought, well, there's something in it. And then I looked, this is 3 years ago, and it said it happened in 1120. I hadn't been sure of the date. And then I said to the publishers, look, I've got a story. It's a cross between Titanic and Game of Thrones. And what do you think? Love an anniversary. They love an anniversary, publishers.
With an elevator pitch like that, you can't go wrong. That's fantastic. I have heard there's a title involved.
Yes, there is. I can't, Paul. I mean, I can't.
I can't draw you.
Well, they said, what did the publisher say? You can make it sound interesting, but don't give the whole game away. So I don't know.
Well, it's a 3-word title. I'm not allowed to give it away, but I have to say it's a stunning.
Act it out. Not allowed to do syllables and all that.
Am I allowed to say one of the words involves a vessel of nautical importance, and the other is a colour?
Okay. Well, that's fine. I didn't give it away.
No, exactly. It sounds fascinating. Listen, you spend a lot of time researching. You spend a lot of time writing. What do you do for fun, Charles?
Well, there's a lot of things I do. So I run a family estate, and it's been in my family for 500 years, and that is really interesting. And it's got so many different aspects to it, and there's always a surprise. I mean, literally before I came on here, there's a man who lives a mile away who we use when we have events here for cooking. And we're turning over the kitchens here. He's going to be feeding 250 people a day at the National Health. And locally, you know, who are doing such heroic jobs against the coronavirus. And so how wonderful that the house can do that. And so I always try and look at this house as, what's it for? It's not a bastion of privilege. It's a wonderful piece of living history, and it's just a privilege to have people enjoy it, really, and to see it as something useful in the community rather than some ivory tower.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm always very impressed, and you impressed on me to me when you first kindly invited me to Althorpe, that although it is your home and your family's home, you are a custodian. You take that responsibility very seriously. I admire you for it.
Well, I think, you know, if you're lucky enough to have the opportunity to look after someone like this, especially if you love history like I do, then it would be very odd not to want other people to enjoy it. And it's fantastic. And I just think, goodness, you know, it's been a backdrop to so many things over so many centuries. And I feel it's so sad when historic houses get sort of ossified. You know, they become sort of just museums. I think they have to be contributing parts to the community.
Exactly. I know that your wife is very active as a philanthropist and has this fantastic charity, Whole Child International. Would you like to tell us about that a little?
Of course, yes. Well, one of the things I was most struck by when I met Karen, which was on a blind date about 10 years ago, was A, she's very beautiful, which is obviously very helpful, but B, somebody had told me, you know, she does do this amazing work. And so she works with various academic institutions and scientific outfits to improve the lot of abandoned and orphaned children and in institutions around the world. And so I've been with her to El Salvador and Nicaragua, looking at the care for the really terribly deprived sectors of the childhood community there. And I love the fact, because she's not just doing this sort of Lady Bountiful act at all. She's very hands-on. She's involved in all sorts of social enterprises, helping across the world. And it's very impressive, actually. It's quite humbling. When I come in and I say, I've just written a chapter that I'm really pleased with. And she says, yes, well, I've just been speaking to so-and-so at the United Nations, and we think we might have found some funding for X. So that puts me in my place. And, you know, the perspective of being, I'm lucky enough to love what I do as a writer, and she has a passion for what she does. So, yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic to have somebody who's really making waves in the world in such a positive way.
Exactly. It's an extraordinary cause as well. If you're interested, do go to www.wholechild.org, www.wholechild.org. It's an incredibly good cause. So, Charles, it looks as if we might be in lockdown for quite some time yet. Are you coping? Are you eating all right? How are you managing? How are you spending your time? I've spoken to a number of authors who say they feel guilt because actually they have no distractions now. And a number of very big name writers who are saying, I feel like a writer again, rather than have to do sort of 7 months of publicity tours and talks and literary festivals and so on. They're saying, you know, I can just sit in my shed and write forever. It's a dream. Are you finding that dynamic or not?
Well, again, I feel guilty saying this because I'm fully aware of how awful it is for the huge majority in terms of their job, let alone everything else, which is catastrophic. Um, so I am actually, I am this month doing the final edit of the book that comes out later this year. So as far as work goes, that's good. But obviously, as a custodian of this house and the many things that generally go on here, we're obviously curtailed. But yeah, there's a huge responsibility in looking after the workforce here. And it probably sounds terribly patronizing, but we, helping some of the people in the community around us who depend on the estate. It sounds very 19th century, but it's still, there is an element of care that goes on. It's not just a business. And no, it's the news that brings it home, the awfulness of it all. And wow, I mean, we'll be looking back on this time forever, won't we? I had somebody come here about 18 months ago and say, oh, this pandemic's coming down the line, it's going to happen very soon. And he's an American billionaire I thought, well, yeah, maybe not. And then you realize, gosh, it's come to pass.
It's just extraordinary, isn't it? I've been saying to the authors who do feel guilt, I said, you shouldn't feel guilt. You'd be useless in an operating theatre, you'd be useless in an ICU unit. You're not a carer. Your job is to be the creative that writes the books, that comes up with the TV shows, the films, the music and so on, that we are really very heavily relying on right now. And if you do your job and keep your end of the sky up, it allows other people to keep their part of the sky up too. So I hope that takes some currency. Charles, thank you so much for your time. It's been so lovely to see you. I'm pleased that you and your family are well. Would you like to say anything to your readers before we sign off?
Well, I would like to follow on your thoughts about the book world, really. I mean, I do think that this is a time for some form of contemplation, whether or just enjoyment of books. Yeah. I mean, this is the first time I've ever really got into Audible books or audio books, and it's fascinating. And I dug up an old favorite and listened to it, which Put Out More Flags by Evelyn Waugh. And it's so interesting, the resonance. So that's a book written in about 1941 or so. And it's so interesting. Evelyn Waugh writes, of course, like a god, but at the same time, there's a lot that really does resonate with what we're going through now. The period of the early part of the war where people had so many theories about how it was going to be, most of them which were wrong, and all sorts of similarities in this coming sort of disaster, and how people react in different ways. So there's so much in literature that you can either use for escapism or as a parallel to your own universe. And I think this is a time for books to lend some comfort to those who have the time to dwell on them.
Well, and here to that. That's very much what we have set up the Lockdown LitFest for, to try and sort of shine a window onto that and how important it is. Charles, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope you have enjoyed this event at the Lockdown LitFest. We are doing our best for you. It's still early days. We do, of course, have some technical issues. We are still trying to find our feet. So if you are worried by failures of technology, please do look away. Bear in mind, if you want to take this interview with you, we have underneath this the audio version of it, which is downloadable. Shove it on your iPod or your phone and have a listen to Charles and I chattering while you are in the garden or wherever. As ever, just so that you know, we are trying to do this to support authors who are struggling. They've lost their live event income and so on. And if you are of a generous disposition, further down the page, you'll see a donate button. And if you have some spare change down the back of the sofa and you'd like to become a Patreon, we'd be delighted to accept it. Equally, we're looking for people to help us. We are a very small team working 100 hours a week each just to try and get this together. And we're hoping to be here not just for these awful times, but for all times and forever and for you. Charles Spencer, thank you so much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, be safe, be well, and take care of yourselves. Cheerio.